Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. Is this the novel of our times? In fact, You Must Take Part in the Revolution is a graphic novel, one for a new generation that likely prefers more images and fewer words, and it explores a near-future dystopia shaped by a US-China war in which America has become a proto-fascist state. Timely, isn't it? You Must Take Part in the Revolution comes from Emmy-nominated journalist Marissa Chan and acclaimed dissident artist Bao Lichao. While it's impossible to ignore the parallels with today's world, Marissa emphasizes that the book is not meant to be instructional or educational. It's meant to entertain. And I can attest to that, so read it. Are you curious what inspired Marissa and Bao Lichao to create this book and why the title is drawn from a Mao Zedong quote? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Melissa, what is the title of the graphic novel You Must Take Part in the Revolution based on the Mao Zedong quote?
Well, we were thinking about book titles, and I had a list and wasn't very satisfied with any of them and started just kind of looking around as one does, on Google and thinking about things. And I started reading Chairman Mao Zedong's essays. I don't know why. I felt by instinct that, the thing we forget is that in the very beginning, Mao Zedong was genuinely moved by the plight of poverty in China, particularly in the rural areas. And it's something that I actually have a lot of ability to imagine because as a reporter based in China, as a foreign correspondent for 5 or 6 years, traveling across the country from about 2006 to 2012, those were my active years in China as a reporter, I saw a lot of that same persistent poverty in the countryside, brought back by a corrupt Chinese Communist Party in the era of liberalization. And so I could imagine just how poor China once was and how badly somebody who was politically inclined wanted to make the world a better place. And I truly do believe that the early version of Mao Zedong was someone who was ideologically driven for the right reasons. And of course, power corrupts, and it's a long journey and road where we all know where it ended up. But I was looking at his early essays, and there was just a line. It's not one of his famous mottos or anything in Chinese, but where he's talking about the fact that you must take part in revolution. And I just wrote that down, and it kind of stuck. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought this made sense, because in many ways, we want to reclaim the words of Mao Zedong. He corrupted the idea of revolution. He corrupted the idea of pursuing a fair system, a fair world where income inequality was not so terrible, right? He was trying to remedy that. And so for so many reasons, we felt like it was important to reclaim it and also to be subversive about it, because the thinking was, surely they wouldn't ban a book with the title that's straight from the mouth of the chairman. So we thought we'd play around with that, which I think you and a lot of people listening would understand. And I really think this is a great title. As much as this is connected to the Mao Zedong quote, I think this is a very, very good title, very relevant to today's world. What inspired you and Bao Lichao to collaborate on this story, and how would you describe the process of integrating text and illustration to create the atmosphere you wanted? I would say that both of us came and approached this and was motivated for different reasons. And I hope you get the chance to talk to him in the future. But I think collectively, first of all, we started working on this 4 or 5 years ago. It's a long process. This is a 264-page graphic novel. For those unfamiliar with this format, it is a comic book, but it is a very long comic book. It is a novel format. And for me, I'd been a journalist for almost 20 years at that point and felt a little frustrated that a lot of the work that I was doing was preaching to the choir. The same people who read it, who understand that China is an authoritarian danger, that human rights is very important, and felt that I wasn't moving the needle in the same way. And I'm both a text reporter and a video broadcast correspondent. And also noticing at the same time, and now we all know because there's a lot more research on it, but that globally, it just felt as if the younger generation people just didn't seem to value democracy as much. And in fact, some of them were quite attracted to autocracy. This is specifically Gen Z and young millennials. And that was very important for us to try to find a medium to meet them where they're at. And I don't think that Gen Z will read a nonfiction work about China policy that's 250 pages long. What I do think they might do is look at a graphic novel. There are a lot of pictures in it. There's a few text as well, but that it is very manageable and digestible. You could sit down in one afternoon and you can read it and finish it. And so that's kind of the impetus for me. For Badioutai, I would just say, based on, our conversations, that he was also deeply motivated by and inspired by the Hong Kong protests of 2019 and 2020. We started working on this book and developing the idea at around this time. For many parts of the world, this was COVID lockdown period. And the COVID lockdown had also slowed down the momentum of the protests in Hong Kong. And so in many ways, we were seeing the movement lose momentum, die off, and wanted to imagine a world where the COVID never came, the protests continued, and where that might end up. And so that's kind of the starting point for that. For both of us, I think we were so deeply inspired. I was born in Hong Kong, and we wanted to pay tribute to the many forms of protest that was part of the Hong Kong movement. And so that's another impetus for our book. And in terms of your question about text and illustration, I would say that this was a very collaborative process. Unusual, maybe even in the comics world, where usually there is a writer and they sort of map out the story and write it out and then hand the script over to an artist who executes. Or a lot of graphic novels are written by one person and drawn by the same person. But because there were two of us, we collaborated very closely. Obviously, with the text, I take the lead in terms of first pass and first draft. But Badioutai was deeply, deeply involved in the construction of the plot in very detailed forms. And also when he was drawing, he might sometimes come back to me and say, this dialogue is not working with the flow of the page. And likewise, I would write a script out for one page of the book. And obviously there's something in my head, I'm imagining the page. And so he would ask me what I have in mind. So I'd literally draw stick figures. So even though he is the artist, I was also a terrible artist, but contributed in my own way. And so over the 264 pages of this graphic novel, you see the finished product. And I tell people that there is a 264-page stick figure version of the book that I drew that will never see the light of day because I'm not an artist and it's terrible. But that was how our collaboration worked. We talked at one point almost every day. We do not live in the same city. We actually live on two separate continents. But we were very committed to the idea and concepts behind the story, and we just got it done.
And the result is great, definitely. Melissa, you said in one of the interviews that you are a journalist and you don't like prognosticating. But the book is set in a near future dystopia, we can say, shaped by a US-China war, and America is a proto-fascist state. So if you look at today's world, how much of the book do you consider speculative fiction, and how much is it rooted in your real-world reporting and observations?
It's definitely rooted in my personal experience as a journalist, not just in China, but I did spend a few years reporting in the United States up to the election of Donald Trump as president in his first terms. I left the United States a little bit before the completion of that election cycle. And I would say that I don't prognosticate in the sense that this book is not meant to say this will be what I think will happen. And this is the interesting thing when you have two authors for one book. Barita and I have different ideas about the likelihood, for example, of China invading Taiwan. Those are things that are very hard to assess. But what I would say is that both of our experiences dealing with authoritarianism clearly contributed to the fictional aspects of the book. And because of our real world experiences, I think that where we are today in the real world, we did not set out to prognosticate with the book, but it does not surprise me that so much of the story has now aligned with real world events, because so much of the fictional work, as I said, was also meant for an audience in mind where I wanted to inform and educate them about human rights, about protest, about China, about the United States, about technology and its ability to surveil. And so I think a lot of that just naturally played into where we are today. But I will freely admit that we didn't quite imagine how timely this book would be coming out in the spring of 2025. And during our US book tour, as we went from San Francisco to Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. to New York, certainly a lot of the question and focus was actually less on the authoritarian China aspect, because people just know that is the case, but about the state of affairs in the United States.
I don't want to push you into prognosticating, but with Donald Trump in the US and Xi Jinping in China, are we closer to the word from your book?
Well, yes and no. We are closer in some aspects, right? Because the book imagines a proto-fascist United States. And I use the word proto-fascist, but I also use the word fascist. I mean, it's fine. It's a work of fiction. Let's not, in some ways, take it too seriously. But it's proto-fascist because the way I imagine it would happen in the United States is that the United States has the strongest civil society of any country I've been to in the world. And that is just the case. And in many ways, people regard the United States, especially those from Europe and also from China, as a young country. But I tend to argue that it's actually a really old country. It's the oldest democracy, right? So many of the republics and People's Republic of China were established so much later. Germany, right, where I'm partially based also. So the modern state, in terms of that, the United States is pretty old. Okay, so I'm a little bit going off topic, but so yeah, I mean, I think that where we are today is similar in that sense of where these two countries are. Where I think I differ is that I'm not sure the current iteration of Trump 2 administration is as hawkish on China as Trump 1. Now, we don't know yet because there's no cohesiveness on that front, but I don't think the American president is inclined to engage in a hot war. He clearly is someone who doesn't like that kind of violence. I say that kind of violence because there has been violence by the state, but he doesn't like that sort of traditional warfare kind of thing. And you kind of notice it with how he wants to bring along the ceasefire on the Gaza issue, but also with Ukraine. You know, regardless of the perpetrator, he just wants it stopped. And I would imagine that if something happened in regards to Taiwan, his first instinct would not be to rain missiles. It would be to say to Chinese leader Xi Jinping, let's make a deal. And so far, what we've seen, especially with the trade war, is that, frankly, my interpretation is that the president of the United States has blinked and he has backed down. He doesn't frame it that way, but it certainly looks like that from East Asia, where I am right now. And I see no reason why he would not blink when it came to confrontation with China over Taiwan, a country, by the way, he's clearly expressed no interest in. He doesn't like Taiwan, in fact, right? He's accused Taiwan of stealing American know-how for the production of its semiconductors, which is a false accusation, by the way. And the way he talks about Taiwan on an emotional level reminds me of the way he talks about Ukraine. And I've said this before, he admires and he likes big things, including big countries, big Russia, big China, right? He might think that he wants to compete with China, but he admires China. And he doesn't like the countries that he views as nuisances to building his relationship with these big countries. And Taiwan is, in his eyes, a nuisance. So I just don't see him as stalwart of a supporter of Taiwan as, frankly, Biden was.
I think you are absolutely right. I think he looks at Taiwan and also at Ukraine as nuisances. Like I want to have a big, beautiful relationship with Vladimir Putin and with Xi Jinping and so on. And those pesky small countries are standing in my way to create a new world of beauty and stuff like this. So I think it's very clear from my perspective. But when you mentioned Taiwan, and you also said something that you have a different view on China possibly potentially invading Taiwan than your co-actor. Can you tell me what's your view and what's his view?
Well, I think Badi Cao thinks that it's much more likely that Chinese leader Xi Jinping will invade Taiwan. And for me, I like to question, and I think you know this very well as a defense expert yourself, that, what do you mean by invasion is the question I always ask, right? If you're talking about military Navy ships rolling onto the shores of Taiwan and pulling a D-Day sort of, uphill battle, I think an amphibious landing it would be very, very difficult. Although the military geeks out there paying attention to what the Chinese are building are seeing evidence of that as an option, right? That the Chinese are building out the possibility of barges that can sort of get them to shore. But, you can also just incrementally change facts on the ground, as we've seen the Chinese do in the South China Sea in regards to its conflict with the Philippines, right? So if they take one of the smaller islands that's a part of Taiwan and just take it, and they're much closer to the Chinese shore, if you look at a map, what will the world do? Like, will the world really go to war over an island that's populated by 1,000 people? And I think that they're going to try to test that. They'll also try to possibly limit and pull an embargo, a naval embargo in and around Taiwan. That could be very dangerous because the semiconductors are still being exported out of Taiwan. It could be a geopolitical issue, right? But I think that they can do a lot of things short of actually shooting Taiwanese dead on the streets before we get to a point where there's an invasion. So that's kind of where my headspace is. But on the other hand, I do think that Badi Cao's instincts are right, that we tend to think very rationally about why China shouldn't invade Taiwan. But I think that even though Chinese leader Xi Jinping is coming across as very stable compared to Vladimir Putin or even Donald Trump, very stable, very calm demeanor, right? Always kind of a little bit of a Buddha, the way he smiles. Let's get real, right? But I do think that we shouldn't discount emotion as a role in leadership, and especially when it comes to autocrats. And the emotional part of this whole story is that not just Xi Jinping, but many people in China believe that Taiwan needs to be a part of China, and it is completely tied to their national identity. And when you have something like a religion, essentially, with that kind of belief, then it will lead to making decisions that are counterproductive to the health of a country.
You said Xi Jinping and Buddha. Maybe Badi Cao would say Winnie the Pooh.
Absolutely. And I call him a Buddha. I mean, like, in many ways, Xi Jinping visually doesn't cut the figure of a villain. And I'm very open to saying that, right? I don't understand why the leader of China was so offended that people compared him to the Winnie the Pooh. That's actually a positive, in my view, a positive comparison, because this is the friendly face. And the fact that he didn't find it funny, or at least the people around him felt that they needed to censor it so that the children of China no longer can buy stuffed Winnie the Pooh animals, just shows you the absurdity of authoritarianism.
Absolutely, yes. Melissa, without going into spoilers, in general, your book has 3 protagonists. Andy is more pacifist, Maggie is more radical, and Olivia is more pragmatic, if I can describe them like this. Is there something autobiographical about them?
There's a little bit of autobiography in all 3 of them. Badi Cao has told me and told others that he feels most akin to the practical one, not because of the practicality, but because that character is from the mainland. We were very cognizant of creating characters that had reference points to the 2 of us. So, representation is a big conversation that we have in the United States. And I am Chinese American. I was born in Hong Kong. my mother's from Taiwan. And so I was trying to bring that in. And Badi Tao was born in Shanghai. And so we have these backgrounds, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that I left Hong Kong when I was very young. So I wanted to be cautious about representing the voices of Hong Kongers entirely. Because at the end of the day, I'm one of those hybrids, right? I am in the Chinese-speaking diaspora, but I'm very American. And so the reason why the protagonist is very American, which I'm sure you got the vibe of, was intentional. Because I felt like, for a book that's taking place in East Asia, we could come and fall into the danger, primarily for me, of coming across as speaking for the region when I'm actually not Asian in that sense. So we were thinking of representation and bringing our personal stories into the characters. So there's a little bit of, both of us in all three of the characters. But Andy, in many ways, is the Asian American, and I am the Asian American. And in many ways, I felt like writing his voice was easiest for me. So there you go. I don't know if that helps with answering the question, but yeah.
So again, without going into spoilers, I would say that the book doesn't have a definitive ending. So is there a hope, despite what many observers see as a global rise of authoritarianism and nationalism?
There's definitely a space for a sequel. And in that sense, there is hope, right? I mean, that's one way of putting it. And I think that we didn't want to pontificate and say, this is what's going to happen and lay judgment on it. It was really a question of the main thing that we wanted to communicate was that if you choose to resist, there are many ways of resisting, whether violent or nonviolent. But understand that whatever way you choose might be justified in your eyes, and it might not be justified in others. And the other thing is, if you choose more violent means, there is a cost to that. And so, it's a personal toll and a personal cost. And it might feel as if it's important enough for you to do so, but there is a cost on the human. And so we were looking at it from a sort of personal perspective. But the magic of fiction is that it's intentionally meant to allow readers to make their interpretations, right? I think it's a little funny that a lot of people ask us the question of the messaging and intention of the book. I don't think they would if we were just straight up writers and authors who've spent their whole lives just writing stories, right? But it's because of our backgrounds. And this is a bit of a cop-out answer, but this is a creative work. It's meant to be entertaining. It's not meant to be instructional. It's not meant for someone to read and feel as if they're being educated, right? First and foremost, the story had to be good and it had to carry. The characters had to be strong. Our editor's background is as a screenwriter. And so this was one that was very much also focused on, it's fine if a 13-year-old picks up the book, reads it, takes no lessons on human rights and just found it very deeply entertaining. So I think that aspect of it, I do want to also remind people about. And if you do take some lessons or if it does get you thinking about things, that would be great. The other thing that I would say is that there's been a few people, friends of mine, they buy the book, they want to support me, and their teenage kid sees it on the kitchen table. Like, what is this that mom and dad ordered? A comic book? And they picked it up and read it before their parents. And these are American teens who don't study what I have studied. China, authoritarianism, resistance, even a little bit about Hong Kong and where Taiwan is on the map, right? These are American teens. And so that's actually made me really happy because if they read the story and they thought, oh, this is a cool story, and they just learned a little bit more about China, a little bit more about Hong Kong and Taiwan, then we've gotten somewhere, right?
In what kind of revolution would you take part?
Oh, that's such a great question. What I will say is that what really inspired me about the movement in Hong Kong was how everyone understood that every person had a role. And there was little judgment from those who were peaceful protesters against those who wanted to throw the Molotovs. And there were also people who felt like they couldn't participate in the protests, who tried to help in other ways. You, I'm sure, read about moving stories of people buying public transport cards, topping it up with, 200 Hong Kong dollars and just putting them all over the stations for the younger protesters, right? So these are older people. There's also wonderful stories about people who didn't want to participate in the protest because maybe they professionally, their day jobs or their families, they couldn't take that risk, but they were doing the driving. So they'd pick people up and drive them across the bay at the end of the night and get them out of that area and to a safer place where they couldn't be tracked. And so a revolution takes everyone to participate in if they want to, and to each, from each, right, that they can to contribute to the movement. So your question about how I would participate in a revolution, I think would depend what is needed at that time and at that moment. And then I will make what I will decide is the best sort of gut check. Now, let's make it a little bit real and talk about what's happening in the United States now. Something I'm thinking about right now. What can I do as an American? And I think that our experience and my time in China is something that I've really tried to communicate to Americans about what's at stake. And also the whole issue of banned books is one that I care very much about. That's happening in the United States. And I think that's where I can contribute some insight covering China, thinking about censorship. And so I think in the coming weeks and months, that's something that I really want to be deliberate about. So that's how I will contribute for now. But maybe there will be greater urgency and I will be called to do bigger things.
Melissa, to wrap it up, as a journalist, you were expelled from China in 2012. Can you briefly explain what happened? And by the way, as we speak, the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index was published. And for the first time in the history of the index, it classified the global state of press freedom as a difficult situation.
Absolutely. So the short version of my expulsion is that China has never clearly declared why they expelled me. And in fact, sometimes their story has changed. Does not surprise you or I in terms of how authoritarian states operate. I would say that they probably didn't like the fact that I did a lot of human rights reporting. They didn't like the fact that I'm ethnic Chinese and that I was going back to the motherland, so to speak, with my American passport. How dare I to write things that are critical of the mother country? They tend to treat ethnic Chinese Americans, Chinese Canadians, and Chinese Australians very differently from ethnically white members of the Foreign Press Corps in China. So that's just a little bit of insight for you there. And political winds were changing. And after my expulsion, as you know, there were quite a number of other reporters expelled, waves and waves of them as they grew bolder. So I was a little bit of a test case because before me, I think there hadn't been a correspondent kicked out for about 14 years. And so, yes, the global environment is very bad. And one thing that I found after my years in China, and then I mentioned earlier that I had started reporting in the United States, was that I was coming back to the United States where average people, when I talked to them, had a greater hostility to the press. And they would sometimes say things in the United States where they were like, well, you're a journalist. Are you really going to interview me and speak the truth? Like you're going to take words and change it. And it could sometimes be very confrontational. And that was not my experience when I had left the United States. So already in the interim years, things had changed and it's gotten only more and more hostile. And so I would say that now, given what is on my social media feed, given what I say, who knows? Each time that I enter the United States with my American passport, whether there might be a little bit more difficulty. And I think about the security of my phone a little bit more when I cross those borders. And that is just something that I never had to think of my entire life as an American going back into my country. And I'm not saying it's going to happen. It's likely not going to happen. But that possibility hangs in my head now in a way that it never did.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.